Hey class, welcome back. I hope everyone's doing well today. In our PowerPoint lecture today, we're going to be moving into another lecture on the Cold War. We'll be talking about one of the first wars of the Cold War, which was the Korean War. And the Korean War, which was not really a war because there was no declaration of war even declared on anybody. It was just fighting that takes place and then stopping of fighting. It's interesting because it continues till today. If you go over to South Korea today and go to the 38th parallel, which is the DMZ, there will be U.S. soldiers and South Korean soldiers standing there on guard with their weapons pointed towards North Korea. And just on the other side of that line are North Koreans with their weapons pointed towards South Korea. Basically what happens is in 1953, the war just stops. There's an armistice and it just kind of ends. And that's how it's been ever since. So it's kind of an interesting war. It's not a very well-known war also, and I'll go into that in the PowerPoint lecture. And then we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go to the Berlin Wall. And you kind of got to get your mind wrapped around this with geography because there's West Germany, which is a democracy, so I'm going to say that's free. And then there's East Germany, which is communist, and I'll say that's not free. Okay, so you have free and not free. Well, in the not free, in East Germany, you have the city of Berlin. Now, Berlin is divided in half, and part of that is controlled by democracies, the United States, Great Britain, and France, and then East Berlin is controlled by the USSR, which is communist. Now, that free part of Berlin, that half of the city, is surrounded by communism, and a wall is built around that called the Berlin Wall. We'll go into a lot of detail about that. And then closing out the PowerPoint today, I did something to show a very important and very well-known location in Berlin, Germany. It's called the Brandenburg Gate, and it was built in the late 18th century, the 1700s, late 1700s, and it has stood the test of time. It is still standing there today, and so I have pictures of the gate, everything from when Napoleon went through it all the way till today, and what takes place. Because no matter what's going on in Berlin, with wars and soldiers and Nazis and all that stuff, the Brandenburg Gate is always there. So just kind of an interesting couple of slides of pictures through time showing the Brandenburg Gate. Okay, class, this is the Cold War, Part 2, and today we're going to be talking about the Korean War and the Berlin Wall. Okay, so the first thing we're talking about is the Korean War, just because it's chronologically it happens before the Berlin Wall. But again, all of this is under the umbrella of the Cold War. The Korean War was June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. Just a little side note, if anyone knows about my background, I come from a very military family, and my grandfather was a bomber pilot in the Korean War, and he was actually in Korea when my mother was born. My grandmother gave birth to my mother while my grandfather was over in Korea, and he was a bomber pilot, definitely bombing the capital in North Korea and other cities also. The Korean War, June 25th, 1950, and my mother was born in 1950, to July 27th, 1953. Some background to the Korean War. Japan had occupied the Korean Peninsula during World War II, and after the war, Korea fell victim to the Cold War. Okay, so because the peninsula is attached to the mainland of Asia, obviously the Russians, the USSR, doesn't want that to be a democracy, so they wanted to be involved, and so next thing you know, Korea is divided in half. It was divided along the 38th parallel, that's the lines on the globe, the 38th parallel. The north section is called North Korea, the south section is called South Korea. And the Americans basically controlled the South, and the USSR installed a communist government in the north. Now, the USSR would be involved in this, but then also later on, they would actually cede some of their control over to China, which was communist. And the Chinese actually had Chinese soldiers fighting in the Korean War. So you have communist China also involved there. June 25th, 1950, the North Korea invades South Korea. They cross the 38th parallel, and they just come in thinking that they can take it. And they invade the South. They almost took the entire peninsula, pushed all the Americans back into this little pocket. They captured Seoul 2 days later after their invasion. They captured Seoul. And this war, the Korean War, was actually the first military action of the Cold War. There's wars all throughout the Cold War time period. There's other wars that go on. This is the first one, the Korean War. United States involvement. The UN promised to send aid to South Korea because of the North's aggression, and the UN passed a resolution to repel the aggressors. And the UN does that a lot. The UN passes resolutions all the time. Believe me, the bad guy does not follow resolutions. I've seen it in my lifetime. Numerous things with the resolutions, with the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein, the second Gulf or the invasion of Iraq, and all with Iran. It's just resolution after resolution after resolution, and it doesn't change anything. Really, it makes the UN pretty weak. June 27, 1950, again, 2 days after the invasion, Truman orders the United States air and naval forces to fight with South Korea's army. And this was done to enforce the UN resolution to stop the communism from spreading. Truman also sent the U.S. Navy to Taiwan to block the Chinese fleet and gave aid to the French who were fighting in Vietnam. So it kind of expands out, as you can see there. During this time period, the United States is still heavily involved in Japan with the occupation of Japan and basically Japan being rebuilt. And so they had to go further south in Japan to Taiwan to block the Chinese fleet. And then giving aid to the French who were fighting in Vietnam, and that's gonna flare up in the 1960s for the United States with the Vietnam War. There were 20 other nations that joined the United States in the Korean War, so don't think the United States was by themselves. There were 20 other nations that also joined in, and they quickly pushed the North out of the South. Okay. The Korean War, let's just continue on with just some basic information, and we'll talk about a couple battles here. AKA, also known as the Forgotten War. It's important to know. The reason is because it was between World War II and a very televised war in Vietnam. And so it's called the Forgotten War because World War II was a world war. I mean, we're talking almost every country on the planet was some way involved in World War II. Major powers had gone to a total war footing where everything was for the war. All industry was for the war, all of that. So we have this massive war in World War II. And then in Vietnam, it was called the Living Room War because you could turn your TV set on every night in the 1960s and 70s and watch on TV what was going on in Vietnam. You would have reporters in the jungle with the U.S. troops in Vietnam, and so that was very televised, and it was like very in front of everybody, right there in their living rooms every night. Well, Korea was not a really big war, and yet it wasn't televised all that much either because of the time period. So it's called the Forgotten War. It's also sometimes referred to just as a conflict, because there was no declaration of war given. There was no declaration of war for the Korean War. One of the battles that we'll talk about is the Battle of Incheon, September 15th, 1950 to September 19th, 1950. This was an amphibious invasion called Operation Chromite. that resulted in a UN victory and reversal to the UN favor. So what happened was the North invaded the South and pushed the U.S., the UN forces, pushed them down in this little pocket, and then during the Battle of Incheon, this amphibious invasion had turned the tables, and now the U.S. forces are able to push the communist forces back into North Korea. The U.S. was led by General Macarthur, and he recaptured Seoul 2 weeks later. Okay, so we'll just insert this in here now because it happened during the height of the war. We have the removal of General Macarthur. North Korea was being backed by China. MacArthur publicly said that he would bomb China, but this was against Truman's orders. In fact, Truman said we're not going to bomb China because Truman wanted to contain the conflict just on the Korean peninsula. And so MacArthur, you have your top general saying I'm going to have China be bombed, and yet the president says no, we're not. And this really became a big deal because of who was in play here. MacArthur was a World War II hero in Japan, and he was also a 5-star general. Now, in the U.S. military, the highest that most people go, officers go, if they go this high, would be a 4-star general. Now, a 4-star general has a lot of power. I mean, these are top guys. Well, during World War II, and even after that, they had a rank called the 5-star general, and there were only a handful of 5-star generals. But MacArthur was one of them. So, I mean, he is like, cream of the crop. And now he's got this big conflict with the president. The president has a conflict with him. Another reason it's a big deal is that it was at the height of the war. I mean, you don't want to change your general out at the very height of a war. And that's what was going to happen. And what happened, it really shocked the political system because basically the world didn't think that Truman was able to do it. They didn't think that the president could just get rid of a general. And the American people didn't really think that Truman had the nerve to basically get rid of MacArthur. But that's exactly what he did. Truman and MacArthur met on Wake Island in the Pacific. Truman gave MacArthur another medal, which he already had plenty of awards, but he had another medal, and then they went off to a private meeting, and in that private meeting, Truman fired MacArthur, and MacArthur was done being involved with the Korean War. Okay, so then we have retreat to the 38th parallel. That's spelled wrong. Sorry about that. And cease in fighting. The Chinese intervened, and when the Chinese intervened, basically the Chinese almost kind of like pushed against the U.S. and UN troops in the peninsula, and the UN decided to withdraw to the 38th parallel, which again was kind of like the original division line. And from 1951 to 1953, it was kind of like a stalemate right along there. There was other battles that went on, but it was kind of like a stalemate situation. And then July 27, 1953, was an armistice was signed, and that formally ended the war. Now, remember what I said, there was no formal declaration of war, so really you can't have a treaty to end the war. So an armistice is basically a time of where you just stop fighting. And that is still going on today. This armistice from July 27, 1953 is still in effect today. It's still separated today at the 38th parallel. That 38th parallel now is called the DMZ, which means the Demilitarized Zone, which is a 150-mile long border between North and South Korea. So if you go there today, in the South, on the DMZ, you will have South Korean Army troops and you will have United States Army troops because we have a base over in South Korea. And we have U.S. soldiers today on the DMZ with our guns pointed towards North Korea. And then North Korea on the other side of the DMZ have their guns pointed towards South Korea. The North is communist and the South is a democracy. So I'll walk through these maps real quick just to give you an idea. So this is the first phase where the North invaded the South. So here's the 38th parallel, this dotted line, and they just invade and they push the United States. It says UN forces, but it's mainly led by the United States. Back here, this is called Pusan, was the city of the Pusan Pocket. That's this little green area here. So they got pushed really far back. But then with the Battle of Incheon and the offensive that takes place, the UN goes and pushes well north of the 38th. They go all the way up here into North Korea towards the Ulu River. And then you have North Korea supported by communist forces pushing down, and you basically get here by Seoul, or they retake Seoul actually. And then the last phase is South Korea and North Korea come to the agreement here at the armistice line of it's not right at the 38th parallel, but it's kind of near it. And the famous town is or city is Panmunjom. There's the DMZ. It's kind of a pixely picture, but DMZ. DMZ today. Now, if you recall, not too long ago, you had the leader of North Korea there on the left and the leader of the United States there on the right, President Trump, and they met at the DMZ. They shook hands over the DMZ line. So right here where President Trump is standing, that's South Korea, and over here, this is North Korea. And it was in an attempt to try to open relations again with North Korea. The same thing happened in Germany, where East Germany was like poor and didn't have a lot of things because it was communist and run by the communist government. And West Germany, which was capitalistic, they had a lot of things. They had money, they had more wealth, affluent, they had everything. It's the same thing with North and South Korea. North Korea is kind of suppressed. They don't have much. It's all controlled by the government. And then South Korea, which is a democracy and capitalistic, they have everything. Basically, they have everything that we have, because we have a major presence in South Korea because of our army base there. The result of the Korean War, there was no real winner. It basically went back to how Korea was, went back to the original starting line. The U.S. did stop the spread of communism on the peninsula, so communism spread into the South, and they kicked communism out. So, that's good, but it's just that little peninsula. And we're going to run into the same thing with Vietnam. The casualties, we have the soldiers that were killed. North Korea, 589,000 dead. South Korea, 138,000 dead. The United States had 33,629 killed in action and over 100,000 wounded. Okay, so that's the Korean War. Now we need to switch gears, go on the other side of the world, back over to Germany, and we're going to talk about the Berlin Wall, because basically next in our timeline we run into the Berlin Wall in 1961. Some background. On August 13, 1961, the German Democratic Republic of East Germany, okay, so that is the government of East Germany. It's German. It's not Russian. It's German, and that's their government. Number one, it's communist, and number two, it's heavily influenced by the USSR. It's almost like a puppet state, basically, because it's part of the communist bloc. They begin to build a wall around West Berlin. So remember, the city of Berlin is in East Germany. All of East Germany is communist. The city of Berlin is divided in half. The east part of Berlin is communist, just like East Germany. The west part of Berlin is a democracy or controlled by democratic powers. Okay? And so they start building a wall around the part that is the democracy. That's democratic. The wall completely cut off West Berlin from East Berlin and cut off West Berlin from the rest of East Germany. So now we have basically this walled-in island of a city called West Berlin. This became a huge symbol of communist suppression. Okay, communism. By doing this, it made them look terrible. Okay, this was a huge issue because it basically made them just as evil tyrants who suppressed an entire city. So what happened was communism was equated with no freedom. The wall also kept East Germans, communists, from fleeing into West Berlin, which were, I'll say it like this, I'll say that were free. Okay, so West Berlin was democratic, and if there was a democracy, and so if someone under the communist East Germany, if they could get into West Berlin, then they could basically live in a democracy. They could have the bells and whistles of a democracy. They could have the freedoms of a democracy. So it sealed them off. The wall was 96 miles long, and 27 miles of that was through the city of Berlin. So here's a map of East and West Berlin, and you see the red line is the Berlin Wall. Now this is the part of the wall that goes through the city itself. And if you look at a map, then out here, this is more country. This is a rural area, is more farmland out here. And so the wall went all the way around. And it might not have been an exact wall out here. It could have been just like high barbed wire fencing. Some area was like that. Checkpoint Charlie was a very famous crossing where you could cross into East Berlin and East Berlin could cross into West Berlin. It was very heavily militarized. There were tanks. There was a lot of military right there. And then the Brandenburg Gate is right there. Keep that in mind for the end of this PowerPoint, the Brandenburg Gate. Okay, so the Berlin Wall. During the time that the Berlin Wall was around West Berlin, which was from 1961 to 1989, there was this idea called the Berlin brain drain. And what that was that while the wall was being constructed in 1961, people aren't stupid, and especially those of academia, and professional business people, basically, they're not stupid, and they know that if they can get into West Berlin, they would have the opportunity then to get out of Germany totally. They could fly out of West Berlin and go to another country, go to the United States. And that's what happened. A lot of professionals and academics, the people in academia, professors and all that, they fled. They left the East Berlin. They left East Germany. They crossed into West Berlin as the wall was being built. They crossed in, and then they were able to get out. And so what they did was they took a lot of their brain with them. They took the scientists and the academics and professionals. They might have higher intelligent capabilities. They're smart or whatever. They fled, and so what happened was it drained the brain power, if you will, of the East Germans. And there's just a picture of some people that are they're basically trying to get into West Berlin. Here's the wall being built. Okay, it just goes right down through the city. Right down through the city. Here's the Brandenburg Gate. Keep that in mind for in a few minutes. The wall just kind of curves around. Here's a picture of Martin Luther King. The Berlin Wall became notorious for escapes. And so here's a couple of pictures of people escaping through barbed wire. Here, this is like a soldier trying to help some kid through. Here's a soldier. This is a pretty famous picture. This is a soldier defecting. He's jumping over some barbed wire. Okay, so the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, some things take place. That's when the Berlin Wall falls. The communist Polish government had fallen. So Poland was communist since the end of World War II, and that fell in 1989. That's supposed to be a capital P. It's Polish, not Polish. Polish. Communist Hungary dismantled its massive electric fence that bordered Austria. So Austria and Hungary border each other, and there was this massive electric fence that was built, and they started taking that down. In 1989, 13,000 East Germans escaped into Hungary, but many more were stopped. They stormed the West German embassy wanting asylum. So we have 13,000 East Germans try to get away. They're stopped. Well, actually, the 13,000, they did escape, but a lot more wanted to, but they were stopped. So those that were stopped returned, and they went to West Germany, West German embassy, and they wanted asylum. Okay. There were also pressures from Western powers. The biggest one was probably June 12th, 1987. President Reagan gave a speech at the Berlin Wall. He was in Berlin. That was the free side, and he's right there, basically on the other side of the wall from the Brandenburg Gate, and he gives a speech and he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And the reason that's very important is because by 1987, the East Germans they basically have consolidated down into being their own country. East Germany was the country, but President Reagan is standing in Berlin, Germany, in West Berlin, Germany, and he's telling the president, or the leader, I should say, the leader of the USSR, Gorbachev, he's telling him to tear down the wall. So it's a very important speech that was given. There were also massive rallies and music concerts at the wall. It was basically coming to the point of there was massive social upheaval going on in Berlin because of the wall. 1987, David Bowie performed at the wall. 1988, Bruce Springsteen performed at the wall. And 1989, David Hasselhoff performed at the wall. And David Hasselhoff performed the year when the wall was being torn down, actually. And it was just a massive celebration. And David Hasselhoff was the big singer. And I don't know if you know anything about David Hasselhoff. I definitely do, because I grew up in the 1980s, and he was on a TV show called Knight Rider, and then later on he was on a TV show called Baywatch. But he also is a singer, and David Hasselhoff is very popular in Germany. So, you know what, I might put in Moodle, I might put a link for one of his, for the video of him singing at the Berlin Wall. So pretty interesting stuff. That David Hasselhoff is the one that was the music concert singer in 1989 when the wall comes down. The wall was attacked, quote unquote, attacked by protesters, and they began to tear down the wall. They tore it down with sledgehammers. They brought in equipment. They brought in cranes. They did all kinds of stuff, and they tore down the wall. November 1991, officially torn down, and that was the where basically there was like the only pieces of the wall left were basically going to be known for memorials and for like museum pieces. So, and when this happened in the 1990s, you could send money. There was commercials on TV that you could send in money to some organization, and they would send you a piece of concrete from the Berlin Wall. I don't know if that would be real concrete from the real Berlin Wall. It could have been some rock from someone's backyard. But I remember that on TV. You could send money in and get a piece of the Berlin Wall. Okay, so here's the Berlin Wall. On the top left is before it is being torn, before it's torn down. You just see all the graffiti and all of that. And then you see it being torn down itself, pieces of the wall being brought down, people jumping over the wall. Here's some kids walking through a big hole in the wall. So the wall's being torn down. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about the Berlin Wall. The last part of this PowerPoint, I just wanted to show you. It's pretty interesting, especially because I'm very interested in Germany and the study of Germany. And also, I just wanted to point out that we focus a lot on military history and the study of military history in Europe and all of that. But there's other parts of history that you can study that's also very fascinating, such as the social history. Like I really like the social history of Nazi Germany. How is it that the Nazis were able to transform a society, and that kind of history? Like, how did they live their daily lives, and how their families were affected, and how business was affected? Very interesting aspect of history to study. And but we've been focusing a lot on military history. Well, one of the symbols of Berlin is called the Brandenburg Gate, and it's always been a symbol in Germany of basically of military power. And the thing is that this Brandenburg Gate was built before Germany was even a country. It was built back in the late 18th century, so late 1700s. Was when the Brandenburg Gate was built. And I just wanted to show you some pictures here of the Brandenburg Gate. The Brandenburg Gate, which is in Berlin, Germany, a very historical landmark in Berlin, Germany that has stood the test of time. Okay, so back here's the Brandenburg Gate. That's this structure with they're not really columns, they're kind of like entryways because they're kind of thick and you can go through them. In fact, you can drive cars through them. Not today, but they could at one time. So this is the Brandenburg Gate, and this is in 1806, so not too long after it was built. And here Napoleon Bonaparte, who we talked about, remember him, he brought his entourage through the Brandenburg Gate in 1806. So that's it right there. In the 1890s, so now Germany's a country. This is a postcard of the Brandenburg Gate. So kind of Victorian. You see the wagon or the carriage with the horse and kind of Victorian dress on this lady here and all that. So just that time period, the 1890s. 1914, World War I. You see the Brandenburg Gate back there. And now what's coming through are German soldiers headed off to the war. This picture was taken in 1914, and it's a parade. You see all the people there all cheering and all that, and here come the soldiers through, and here's their small cannons on the back being pulled by horses. So the Brandenburg Gate back there in the back. 4 years later, in 1918, post-World War I, now Germany's they lost the war, and now they're kind of in an upheaval. And remember the Freikorps? Well, we had a lecture not too long ago about the Freikorps. Well, here's some Freikorps members on the back of a truck. And again, Germany is entering into a time of upheaval. But there's the Brandenburg Gate right there in the back. And then here we go in 1936. Now we have the Third Reich is in power. Hitler's in charge. He's the Führer. And now we have the Brandenburg Gate. And you see the cars driving through. Here's Hitler in his car. And one thing I wanted to point out in regards to this is that notice you have the Olympic flags hanging also right next to the swastika. So, very important symbol in Germany. And then in 1945, the fall of Berlin, there's the Brandenburg Gate. And you can just see the condition of it after the Russians had moved through and defeated the Germans in Berlin. It's heavily damaged. Obviously, all the buildings around it are damaged. So 1936, here's Hitler driving through it. And then 9 years later, there it is, completely damaged. 1961, the Brandenburg Gate has been kind of repaired, and this was before the Berlin Wall was built. So you have there's just some wire across with a policeman. It basically says attention that you're going to be leaving West Berlin. If you cross this barbed wire, you're going into East Berlin. 1965, now you have a wall being built in front of the Brandenburg Gate. So 1965. And 1989, that's when the wall comes down. There it is, the Brandenburg Gate. Now this Brandenburg Gate, that is in East Germany, so this is in communist part of Germany. And where these people are down here in the bottom of the picture, this is West Berlin. So these are like the free people, and you see they're all standing on top of the wall. So, you know, they're the wall is going to come down. In late 1990, they went through a big refurbishment of the Brandenburg Gate. So there's a picture of that, and then here's the Brandenburg Gate today. Right there, so it's more of a tourist attraction today. You can go through it. You can't drive through it anymore. You can just walk through it. So there's the Brandenburg Gate today. And hopefully someday I'll be able to go visit it and take a picture with my cell phone. The Brandenburg Gate, Berlin, Germany. Okay, so that is it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's going to be it for today. We got a good grounding on the Cold War. We're going to continue with the Cold War. Next time, we'll be looking at Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then moving into Vietnam. We'll be talking about Vietnam. Vietnam is probably going to be its completely own separate lecture, PowerPoint for the Vietnam War, and then we're really headed towards the end here. So keep up on your reading. Papers are due coming up, so make sure you're working on your papers. Any questions or problems, shoot me an email, and I try to get back to you guys as soon as I can with the emails and answering questions. So shoot me an email, and I'll get back to you and help you out